Check, check, 1, 2. All right. Check, 1, 2. Okay.
The closest you can get it to your mouth, the better without it being under your chin.
Check, 1, 2. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
We forget how spoiled we are that we don't do this all the time now.
So I have a little anecdote about filling up the church from the back. You want to hear a little anecdote about filling up the church from the back? So the first time I ever led high holiday services, I was hired in a congregation in Bethesda, Maryland, that was Congregation Brigadoon. It only appeared on the high holidays. The rest of the year it didn't really exist. And they had it in a high school auditorium. So 650 seats. It started at 9 o'clock. By 11, the place was full, but at 9:30, there were like 3 rows of people, 250 feet, 100 feet away, whatever it was. So the second day of Rosh Hashanah, we put yellow tape on the back 3 rows, and we put VIPs only. You have to pay a lot to be able to sit back here. Dennis, how are you? Good to see you. Thanks for coming.
Is the Christian identity Christian?
That's a good question. Get that question answered in the program.
Okay. Because I know that is kind of.
Yeah, I think it probably is, but you should probably ask that question during question and answers if it doesn't. Hey, Gary.
Let's see.
How are you? Good to see you.
Yeah, good to be here.
Hey, there it goes. I got it on.
Yep,
Am I
can
coming
hear
through?
you. I can
All right,
hear
cool
you.
beans.
Yeah. No clue. That's the deacon. So should we just switch back and forth? Okay, you got 3 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Check, check, check.
On a three.
This one was muted,
I see.
so now it's still muted right now. Once you get it,
It goes like this.
should we tape it for him?
Yeah, you want to look like Madonna?
No, then we'd have one of them big fancy boom mics that cost hundreds of dollars. Usually we'll put one, I don't want to catch hair on you. And if you're not going to move
Check
it out
1, 2, 1,
that's
2.
probably going to be fine.
Oh, but I'm still muted, right? So I can't check it
No,
yet.
you're on.
Oh, am I on?
Yeah,
John Robert?
I can hear it.
Check 1, 2. Check 1, 2.
Can hear it. I'm good. I checked.
All
It's
right.
great.
You are good.
So this is your slideshow.
Do you want to sit next to the computer? Would that help?
I plan on probably standing up while I'm talking, so.
Okay,
I also have
because you're a teacher.
And,
a preacher.
oh, God, no. No. But I am neurodivergent, but I have a hard time sitting still when I'm excited.
I may stand up too.
Yeah.
I always stand up because I am a preacher.
Same here. I know it feels funny to sit.
You know, I've got one class this semester that is it's a seminar, and it's the first time I've been sitting while teaching, I think ever, maybe. It's been a really long time. It's weird. It's weird.
I think we probably can.
Ready?
Good.
Just a couple of quick notes before we officially begin. There are restrooms and drinking fountains available if you go out of the sanctuary to the back to your left and then make another left. You will see the signs right away. This is also a friendly reminder to put your phone on silent or turn it off before we awkwardly pause for you to remember after it's too late. There is a sign-up sheet you may have seen in the hallway, and I have another one here that I will send around during the question and answer time. That it does help us if you even just put your name so that we can kind of keep track of numbers of participants. But also the real purpose of the spreadsheet is if you want to be receiving our emails, and you might have a better answer to that question after you've heard the program. So I will start the sign-up sheet around after we hear from the panel. So I'm going to go ahead and say welcome, good evening, hello everyone. Thank you for being here. We also want to say hello to those who are joining us by live stream tonight. Thank you also for being here. I especially want to thank our hosts at St. David's Episcopal Church for making tonight's evening possible. My name is Rachel Pryor. I am from Lindsborg, Kansas, and I am an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. I am the Associate Conference Minister for this region of the UCC, and I am also, after spending 6 years on the board of Kansas Interfaith Action and 3 years of that as chair, I'm now honored to officially serve as staff, and so I'm really just getting paid to do what I've been doing as a volunteer for quite a while. I am the Director of Engagement for KIFA, and I am your MC this evening. To start off, I will share a brief introduction about KIFA, and then we'll have, each of our panelists will have about 10 minutes to share their portion of the discussion, and then we'll open it up to some Q&A and conversation for the remainder of the time. So KIFA is how we say our acronym, K-I-F-A, for Kansas Interfaith Action, is a nonpartisan, multi-faith advocacy organization with a focus entirely on statewide legislation. We don't do national or global issues. We just focus on what's here, right here in our state. We help local communities of faith put their faith into action by walking with you through what is an often complicated and even opaque democratic process for faith-rooted moral advocacy. Our work tends to fall into 4 main categories inspired by the values of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders of the civil rights movement, including economic injustice, racism and identity-based discrimination of any kind, violence-related issues, including criminal justice, common sense gun reform, and domestic violence, and creation justice or environmental degradation. While many of us at KIFA, and maybe some of you, find faith-based advocacy to be an uncomfortable mixture of religion and politics, we take heart in the pluralistic witness we bring to the State House. We do not always represent at KIFA a single unified point of view. But we do bear witness to religious diversity in Kansas and to an often unified voice for dignity, mercy, and care for the poor, marginalized, and disenfranchised, which unites people of faith and good conscience in all of our work together. We are about to dive into a conversation that is at root about religious freedom and freedom from religiously motivated violence. And in this sense, concerns about white Christian nationalism tie together the entire range of our legislative priorities. So we will start out with a basic introduction to the topic, and then we'll move into faith community and legislative responses. And we would like to thank Dr. Chris Jones, Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Washburn University, for being here with us tonight. His academic focus is in Hebrew Bible, specifically in Ezra and Nehemiah. He and his wife have lived in Topeka for 7 years. Thank you, Dr. Jones, for being here tonight and for starting us off with some history and terminology on this topic.
All right, am I coming through? All right, good. I'm a teacher at heart, and I tend to move around a lot, so I'm going to give myself that freedom, because otherwise I'll sit and I'll fidget the whole time. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So if we can get the slides up.
That's something I'm supposed to be doing?
I don't know who does that.
It looks to me like...
There we go. All right. So what I want to present tonight, really simple, just 3 basic propositions about white Christian nationalism that'll help kind of anchor the conversation. And the first one is that it's not new. We have a tendency to be appalled and shocked by the rise of Trumpism, the rise of white Christian nationalism in the past 8 to 10 years or so. But really, it is not an aberration in American history. Quite the contrary. The idea of a multicultural democracy is, in fact, the more aberrant idea in American history. The United States was founded as a white apartheid state and has been that for much of its history. We really have not been a democracy in the fullest sense of the term since about the 1960s, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which gave the franchise of the vote to Black Americans throughout the country, and thereby created something more like actual democracy. So white Christian nationalism at heart is an attempt to go back to and pull back up that root notion of what America should be. And so that's not to say that it's legitimate or that it's right or that it's good. It's to say that you can't dismiss it as a fad. This has deep roots in American history. So going back, my first little piece of evidence here, the 1790 Naturalization Act passed by the first Congress of the United States. And notice what I don't know if you can see this, it's very small, but I'll read it for you. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that any alien being a free white person who shall have resided within the limits under the jurisdiction of the United States for the term of 2 years may be admitted to become a citizen. So effectively what that says is that if you weren't born in the US and you want to become an American citizen, you got to be white. You got to be a white person, a free white person. And so up until 1865, with the passage of the Civil War amendments, Black Americans, even in the North, were effectively barred from effective citizenship, particularly after the Dred Scott decision. And so US citizenship was understood to be something for white people, people who were designated as white. Now, what makes somebody white? I'm glad you asked, because that's never been clearly defined. If you would move on, please. Let me tell you about a police officer born in Lebanon, moved to the United States, to Los Angeles in the early 1900s, George Shishim, a Lebanese man who was a cop in Los Angeles, and he got into some trouble because he arrested the son of a powerful businessman, and the son said, well, wait a second now, this guy's not white. He can't arrest me. He's not able to be a citizen. So they went to court over it and challenged it. And at first, the judge ruled that Shishim, because he is Arab, could not be considered a white person and therefore not eligible for citizenship. But then he clarified something very important. He's a Christian. And when he clarified that he was a Christian, that then opened up the possibility of him being admitted as white. And so we need to understand that whiteness and Christianity have often intertwined in American history, that to be white was to be considered Christian. To be Christian was to be considered white through much of American history. Again, the idea of multicultural, multiracial democracy is a relatively recent idea as a Pan-American idea. And again, not to say that many people have not fought for those things, have not believed those things very deeply in many, many parts of American history, but they were minoritized voices until relatively recently. If we could move on, please. Okay, so proposition number 2, white Christian nationalism has gone from proactive to reactive. So effectively, the Naturalization Act of 1790 was the law of the land until 1952. And really, the idea of America as a place that has a broad multiracial coalition of humans is a product of the post-1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act that removed quotas from countries of origin for immigrants to the US, opening the door for many, many people from South Asia, East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera, to immigrate and become citizens of the United States. Now, something else happened in the 1960s that we need to be thinking about here, which is, of course, the civil rights movement. School integration finally becomes a reality through much of America. We Topekans know 1954, or 52, am I getting my dates right here? 54, that's what I thought. Okay, trust your first answer. Was when the Supreme Court ruled on Brown v. Board, but it wasn't implemented until much, much later. And so part of the story we need to understand is about the origins of the modern Christian right. Okay, so coincidentally, I'm sure the modern Christian right originates around the same time that the US becomes a multiracial democracy, the 1960s. And in the 1960s, you may be aware that with integration in the South, many white Southerners sent their kids to segregated private schools to keep them out of integrated schools. Segregation was a major political wedge in the South. But come the 1970s, people realized that it was probably a losing issue on a nationwide level. And so in order to find common ground for white conservatives to band together, they started to focus on abortion. Okay, and so in the early 1970s, the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant convention in the United States, was pro-choice. It came out in favor of the Roe v. Wade decision for a variety of reasons. It took much longer for the Southern Baptists and other Protestant conservatives to come around to the pro-life position. And so the pro-life movement in many ways originated as a cipher for school integration and a way to unite white Christians around a common cause, okay? And so that's an important part of that history. Now let's see, what else did I have up here? Oh, yes, we should also make sure to talk about this issue of the terms Christian and Judeo-Christian. So we need to understand the United States has not always been a tremendously religious nation. The time of the founding of America actually was quite secular in American history. There's been kind of an ebb and flow, but the important thing is this, okay? In the public sphere of the United States, for most of its history, the assumption was that whiteness and Christianity were the norm. If you were a member of the public, you were expected to at least be reverent and respectful to the norms of whiteness and Christianity, even if those things did not describe you. And so we see some movement along those lines in the 1940s and 50s with the Second World War and the inclusion of Judeo in the Christian norms of America. This is largely a move to incorporate Jews into Christianity more broadly, without including Judaism as a distinct religion. It's a way ultimately to other people outside of white European heritage and history. And then since that time, we have seen a further re-entrenchment of Christianity as a norm. As the public spheres become more secular, Christians who wish to keep the public sphere Christian have become more reactive. And that leads me to the final point, which will be fairly quick, which is that white Christian nationalism, we should focus on results, not self-identification. There are certainly people who self-identify as white Christian nationalists, though their Twitter handles will say it, they will say it out in public. They are the minority of that group. Overwhelmingly, what we need to focus on if we're going to deal with white Christian nationalism is the results of legislation. So legislation that makes it harder for non-white, non-Christian people to thrive in the US serves the aims of white Christian nationalists. The playbook of white Christian nationalism is by and large not to directly advocate for white Christian nationalism. It is to do things like disenfranchise voters who would vote against white Christian candidates, to make it harder for people to serve in office if they are not white and Christian, to effectively amplify the political power of the minority of white Christians in the United States as the demographic shift over time. So that's what I have for you. I will go ahead and cede the floor to others. Thank you.
For many of you, our next panelist, I think, doesn't need an introduction. Mother Doreen Rice is the rector here at St. David's and has been here for a little more than a year. She also serves on KIFA's board as one of our board members and on the board of the YMCA here in Topeka. Mother Doreen has been serving as a priest in Kansas for 8 years, and on tonight's panel, she will be giving voice to the urgency of the role for faith leaders and faith communities as a counter witness to white Christian nationalism.
Thank you. So I just wanted to start out, I'm not going to have probably as great a presentation as this, but I just wanted to talk about, how does white Christian nationalism, how does Christian nationalism manifest itself in terms of Christianity? And so we're not going to say that white Christian nationalists aren't Christian. We're not going to say that, but they do, folks that in that sphere look at Christianity as the law of the land, so to speak, that civic life, politics, all have to be blended together. And that America, you'll hear this all the time. You're hearing this in Washington, that America was founded as a Christian nation, and it still is. And that Our view of Christianity is what is going to control legislation, laws, how this country operates, regardless of the religious diversity in this country. So that if you are a non-Christian or you are a person of no faith, then really you don't have a role to play. And people of faith, all of us, say, no matter who you are, you have a role to play. Even if you don't believe, you have a role to play in civic life, and you actually have an obligation to engage in civic life. White Christian nationalists will say that Christianity is privileged by the state, and that if you're a good patriotic American, well, you're probably white and you're Christian. And only God can cure America's ills. And I found this on a Facebook friend of mine. She posted this, and it looks sort of like a political ad, but it says, Jesus Christ 2024, only Jesus can save this nation. And again, it's this view that the diversity in this country doesn't matter. That what is the reality and what is good is a relationship with God in that sense, that then dictates all of American life. When you think about Christian nationalism too, this is what people want. So you may have just read how Texas was trying to pass a law that the 10 Commandments were going to be shown in every school, public school. It didn't pass. But it's things like that. Like they bemoan the loss of prayer in schools. It's the ruin of our children. They want Christian symbols in the public square, even if you're not Christian. Political leaders should be Christian. And of course, they want things like closing the border. And Chris talked about that. All the anti-Muslim, anti-Semitism, all those things that are sort of hallmarks with what goes on. So for people of faith, we feel that white Christian nationalism is a threat to democracy, because inherently democracy in this country is diversity. And as people of faith too, we believe every single person, regardless of who they are, is created in God's image. And we are to love everyone, no matter who they are. And Christian nationalism doesn't feel that way. So it sort of distorts the love and the ministry and life of Jesus, especially, and the good news of what Jesus taught. So we have to speak out. We have to do things like this. We have to say why this is not right, why this is frightening, why this is a problem, because we're going to lose out on the ability to be who we are and to live the lives that we want. We in this room, but we in this country too. Okay, I think that's it.
I'm pleased to introduce as our final panelist the founding executive director of Kansas Interfaith Action from Overland Park, Rabbi Moti Reber. Rabbi Moti is in his 16th legislative session with KIFA, including our early years as Kansas Interfaith Power and Light. He is our official lobbyist in the State House, spending the sessions in Topeka and helping all of our volunteer advocates know where, when, and how to bear witness to the issues that matter most to us. When we are not focused on the legislative session, Moti travels the state, making visits to local faith communities and facilitating educational and informational forums like this one. Rabbi Moti is a graduate of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Wyncote, Pennsylvania, a lifelong activist on peace, social justice, and environmental issues. He brings a variety of pulpit, interfaith, and organizational experience to the work of KIFA. Moti is here today in the role of policy expert, speaking to some of the ways we have seen and expect to see in the coming session white Christian nationalism affecting statewide legislation as well as local elections like city councils and school boards.
Thank you. It's good to be back at St. David's. I think it's been a whole 2 weeks since I was here. So I'm talking about policy and how this manifests itself in our politics. Come on. All right. So first thing is January 6th. So are we on this thing?
There we go. Yeah.
Okay. Oops. All right. Now, one of the things that you've heard is that the founding myth of Christian nationalism is that America was born as a Christian nation by Christians, and that making America great again means going back to that original framing. So this is January 6th. January 6th was largely one of the things that's important to understand is that Christian nationalism is not a form of religion necessarily. It's a form of politics. It's a form of group identity. We're saying it's not Christianity, but we're also saying it's a way. There are many people, including Trump himself, who identify as Christian or identify with or as Christian nationalists who you wouldn't necessarily see in church, even the far right church, because that's not what it's about for them. It's a way of identifying. It's a team to be on. It's an identity. So January 6th was about that identity. And it was also about the idea that the way that the people who own this country should be able to run it, so to speak, white Christians. So this is Mo Brooks, is a representative from Texas. I think we lost this thing. Did I lose this thing? Did I do something? Okay. I guess it doesn't really matter. You're not going to be able to read this anyways. My great PowerPoint skills. The text is really tiny. So this is Mo Brooks speaking to the crowd on January 6th. He demanded to know if the crowd was willing to make a sacrifice. He talked about the sacrifice of the founding fathers. Are you willing to do the same? Cheers. My answer is yes. Are you willing to do what it takes to fight for America? Arguing that America must get back to a godly foundation, a foundation it does not actually have, is a standard belief in Christian nationalism, and Brooks repeated the trope. We American patriots are going to come right at him, and we American patriots are going to take America back and restore the foundational principles that have combined to make us the greatest nation in the world history. All right, so that's kind of, January 6th is the greatest manifestation of Christian nationalism as a political force. Now, I'm going to cover a couple of things that are happening in other states under the aegis of Christian nationalism, and then we'll turn to Kansas. But a lot of this is related, and it's not qualitatively different than what we're seeing here, although some of the specifics might be different. So the first thing is, in North Carolina, there's a group called Renewal Project, North Carolina Renewal Project, that is basically growing a political arm. A Christian nationalist group that rejects the separation of church and state. Now, the rejection of the separation of church and state is a core principle of Christian nationalism, that it's somehow a myth or a misreading of the Constitution or of how America was founded. So it works to recruit and run for office people who hold these principles, including Christian doctrine should be mandated in public schools, anti-LGBTQ, anti-non-Christians holding elective office, and even against Christian churches that they find insufficiently conservative, which I think are many. So you see that in the way that people are related when Kifa brings people into the legislature and they talk to particular representatives and they see how, when people are skeptical about a woman in a collar or whatever, that happens a lot. Okay, Texas was mentioned. There was a bill passed last year to allow school boards in Texas to hire chaplains instead of counselors. So you could hire a chaplain. So I don't know how much you know about right-wing Christianity, but you don't have to have much training to be a pastor in right-wing Christianity. It's not a lot of depth there. So you're having no counselor training, certainly, Not necessarily even any theological training, not that we should expect that of a school counselor, but just somebody calls themselves a chaplain, somebody calls themselves a pastor could be hired as a chaplain. So the public school, each school district had to decide whether they were going to allow that to happen, whether they were going to institute this policy. So public education advocates in Texas have to go from school board to advocate for them not to pass this policy. So each individual school board has this decision. Now, a lot of them are choosing not to do this, but it's a huge lift when you have other things to be worried about, to have to go to every single school board to try to get them not to hire Christian ministers as school counselors. And it's not going to help it's not going to help mental health, it's not going to help school results. It's part of putting Christianity into this understanding of Christianity. I've got to sort of say that again. It's not Christianity that's the problem here. It's this Christian nationalism. It's this particular understanding, a politicized understanding of Christianity. One thing that we did see in Kansas was an attempt by far-right forces to take over school boards. You saw it 2 years ago and you saw it this year. It happened in Shawnee Heights, right? So because in Kansas, the State Board of Education sets curriculum and policy. The legislature has a limited ability to influence that. So the school boards, the State Board of Education and local school boards make decisions about curricular items, policies, and so if you can't do it through the legislature, you have to do it through the school boards. That means you have to take over the school boards. So there was a big concerted effort with a lot of money, dark money, to attempt to take over school boards. It happened in Johnson County. It happened here. It's happened in other places. We're very fortunate that there was a big backlash. That strategy has not succeeded in many places, including in Kansas. And in Shawnee Heights, the entire slate was defeated. We're very grateful to say. But, you know, we went to Emporia. We have the Small Cities Project that we're doing, and we travel around to some of the smaller cities. And we went to Emporia, and we're having a meeting, you know, not unlike this one. And we said, well, you're the school board. And they said, we just did this 2 years ago. And the answer is, yes, you just did this 2 years ago. The difference between moderates and liberals and conservatives is that moderates and liberals think when the battle is won, that it's won forever. Conservatives, just look at the Christian right. You know, conservatives come back and fight another day. They are not finished. And we have to be like that too, because democracy is not a spectator sport. And we're not going to be able to keep our democracy if people assume that the battle has already been won. This is the other place where this manifests itself is through the attempt to censor school libraries or curricula, mostly focusing on minoritized populations, particularly Black history and culture, and LGBTQ culture and expression. So this is kind of an outgrowth of the CRT panic from a couple of years ago. You know, if history and culture is going to be outlawed from schools, whose history and culture is going to be outlawed from schools? It's not going to be George Washington, right? It might be George Washington Carver. I'm not sure. You know, I mean, we have a board member who says the only thing African American board member who says the only thing he ever learned in school was Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass, and a little bit about Rosa Parks, and that's it. And now they want to get rid of that. But I like Toni Morrison, all that stuff. You know, anything that's not in the kind of understanding of how sort of conservative white people want to see the country is rife for banning. So that's the other piece. That's another piece of the educational conversation. And another piece of the educational conversation is the attempt to take public funding out of public schools and to put it in private, unregulated home and religious private schools. We call that vouchers. Now, vouchers is actually kind of a toxic word in politics, so they don't call it vouchers, but they call it educational savings account. They have all kinds of terms of art about it. But what it really means is taking public money and spending it on private and home schooling. And those are not, that's a resegregation of public education, which is already significantly segregated due to housing segregation. I mean, we have not done what we needed to do on that front, but this is even worse. And it's essentially a segregated, Micah Kubik from the ACLU calls it a segregation academy. And the reason that this has failed in Kansas so far is because rural Republicans know that if 2 or 3 or 5 kids leave the school district to go learn around the kitchen table, it's going to kill the school district. School districts can't survive without the state funding that's dependent on the population. So they'll go to 4-day school weeks. We are seeing this in other places. Missouri, at many places in Missouri, they're doing 4-day school weeks. In many places in Oklahoma, they're doing 4-day school weeks because they're defunding public education. I think this is super important to talk about because public education is one of the last common things we do in common in this country. It's one of the last things we do that's for the public good, irregardless of whether somebody is rich or whatever. It's open to every student, every child. That is a project that has been undermined significantly by the privatization of public life. We still have a functional public school system, but it's not under the control of Christian nationalists, and it's also it costs a lot of money and it costs taxes. So that's why it's under attack. Now this is last year's bill. Right now, it doesn't look like they're going to try to pass a vouchers bill this year because they know they don't have the votes for it. They're waiting for a more sympathetic governor because they can't override a veto, but they can get a majority. So we had to test. This is my life. Unfortunately, I have to say this. Testimony submitted for Bill 2218. 26 in support, anti-public education people. 268 in opposition, including advocacy groups, parents, public ed, school districts, teachers, private citizens. So 268 to 26 means that 26 wins, right? That's the way it is in the Kansas legislature. Just ask April about that. Right? And then another way that this manifests itself in politics is in the attempts to suppress the vote. So in a situation where white Christians are in a majority, it's less of an issue because if everybody votes, then those people are going to win anyway. In a situation where the population is more even or even black and brown people are a majority in many places. If they vote fully, then they might win elections. So you undermine the legitimacy of elections, but you also undermine the ability of people to vote. And we see that Georgia is really the king of this. Where they just knock people off the rolls if they haven't voted in a couple of elections. You have to keep re-registering people over and over again. Here, what we see is attempts to ban drop boxes, attempts to limit early voting, Kobach's famous attempts to make people have to bring a birth certificate to register. That was thrown out by the courts. I mean, these are all related efforts, and they're not unrelated to the rest of this project. Right, so we tend to think of, okay, school vouchers is this, and voting rights is this, and LGBTQ is this, but it's not. It's all part of the same project. I'll just read you a little bit of this. National representative data collected weeks before the 2020 elections revealed Christian nationalism is a leading predictor that Americans deny that voter suppression is a problem. So Chris mentioned they don't identify necessarily as Christian nationalists, they identify as Christians, but we have indicators. So if they answer questions in a certain way, then they're identified by sociologists as Christian nationalists. So identification as Christian nationalist is a leading predictor that people think the 2020 election was fraudulent, that support measures to disenfranchise individuals who could not pass a basic civics test, we argue that Christian national. This is Perry and Whitehead, who wrote this article, wrote a foundational book, Understanding Christian Nationalism, looking at it from a sociological perspective. And I highly recommend this book. Whitehead and Perry is the name. So they wrote this article comparing Christian nationalism identity with support of restricting voter access and belief that the 2020 election was fixed. Appeals to America's religious heritage thus facilitate stratifying America's citizenry and justifying restricting participation to preserve dominance. So why do you do this? You do it so you can continue to win elections, to continue to control the courts, to continue to control the mechanisms of power. And if democracy is in conflict with the right people being in charge, then it's democracy that has to go away, because we have to be in charge. That's the key element of this whole thing. And then, of course, we have LGBTQ plus issues. So last year there was a huge wave of, across the country, not just here, but here too. There was a big effort to, particularly around trans people, because the transness kind of offends people in a different way, because it's like against what they see as the hierarchies that should exist. So if male and female, black and white, where does transness fit into that? It calls these boundaries into question. So it's threatening in that way. Kobach became Attorney General after this bill was passed, and he's now saying that they will not allow gender changes on birth certificates. So they're in court about that. Whether that bill actually says that will be determined by the courts. We think it probably doesn't. But there were a number of successful attempts last year to pass legislation that would restrict the rights of LGBT people to access public spaces and to change their identity markers in keeping with their identity, as opposed to the sort of ascribed gender at birth. And one of the ones that came up was the trans sports bill, which would prohibit trans girls from taking part in girls' sports. It was framed largely around sort of competitive Olympic sports, even though a very, very, very small minority of people play sports at that level. But every sport was included and every age was included. So, what is this really about? And if you're claiming that you're protecting women from trans women, where's the real rights for women? Where's the equal pay? Where's protection against domestic violence or sexual violence? There's a lot of things. This pastor this is a UCC pastor from Lawrence, Caroline Dean, and she testified on our behalf. And there's a list of things that we could ask for, equal pay being one of them, bodily autonomy being one of them, the right to health care, the right to housing, the right to food, the right to clean water, the right to a stable climate. I mean, these are not necessarily women's rights exclusively, but if you're talking in the language of rights, why is the only right the right not to have to go to the bathroom next to a trans woman? Right? That's the only right. That's the one that resonates. So anyway, in certain significant ways, we're losing this, because you can see where the Supreme Court is right now, who's on the Supreme Court and what they're talking about. And we also have a Speaker of the House who is a dyed-in-the-wool Christian nationalist. He was one of the ones who invented this idea that you could throw out the election results from Georgia and Pennsylvania and Michigan. When they were going to try to when the House was going to try to not certify Biden's election, it was Mike Johnson who was running that campaign, and now he's the Speaker of the House. That's frightening. And I just want to mention one thing. This is a new slide. We've done this program several times, but I just became aware of this thing called Project 2025, which is from the Heritage Foundation and is part of a collection of conservative organizations, mostly using Koch money, but not only. And they have a plan for what happens once Trump gets back into office, to replace a lot of the federal employees with political appointees. Let me read a little bit of this. It's a changed approach to conservatives who traditionally sought to limit the federal government. Now they want to gut the administrative state by ousting federal employees they believe are standing in the way of the president's agenda and replacing them with like-minded officials more eager to fulfill a new executive's approach to governing. I want to point out, this wasn't mentioned earlier, but I want to point out there's an organization called the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. Amanda Tyler is the chair of it, or the executive director of it. And she says she's a, which kind of minister is she? She's a Baptist minister, obviously. Yeah, American Baptist. I believe that the single biggest threat to religious freedom in the United States is Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is antithetical to the constitutional idea that belonging in American society is not predicated on what faith one practices or whether someone is religious at all. I will also point you to Christians Against Christian Nationalism, which is a specifically Christian effort. I think there's 50,000 signatures on this from all 50 states. Take a look at that material. There's a lot of good material on that site, but it's also a statement that you can sign that you as a Christian are going to stand against Christian nationalists. The reason why we're having this conversation in Christian communities is because it's incumbent upon white Christians to push back on this, because this is largely an internal white Christian conversation. And they're, they're taking your religion away from you and using it for bad purpose, So how to respond? Oppose policy priorities that are inspired by the ideology of white Christian nationalism. I've given you a list. Now, things might seem separate or unrelated when they come up in the Kansas legislature, but they're not separate and they're not unrelated. It's part of an underlying project. So even if one issue doesn't seem to resonate with you, you have to remember where this comes from. That's something that comes up with Kiefer all the time, because we don't want to fight everything, but there's a lot of things that we feel like we have to get involved with because we see where it's coming from and we see what effect it will have. Continue your research. Find out the groups in your area. Knowing that group in Shawnee Heights was a Christian nationalist was Christian nationalist was important in that election. It's important to know where these things are coming from. Identify trends in the area. Who's vilifying queer people? Who's talking about drag shows or any of that kind of stuff, school board takeovers. Support multi-faith, multiracial democracy. That is the project that we're engaged in. I want to point out something that I've thought about quite a lot. It was pointed out, Chris pointed out that America wasn't a full democracy until 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. 1968 was already black backlash, George Wallace, right? It didn't last very long before there was a huge backlash. And Reagan was the biggest backlash about it too. Write op-eds, vote, participate locally, make your voice heard. Organize in your houses of worship and communities against forces of censorship, privatization of schools. Going to the Capitol, going to the State House as people of faith, saying my faith supports multiracial democracy, we want you to support that as well, is a very powerful witness, because it doesn't allow them to frame it as Christians and anti-Christians or Christians and secular humanists or whatever the flavor is. If you go, we always think the most powerful thing is when we bring people in collars. Not that you have to have a collar on to be able to do this, but it's very powerful to see people walking around witnessing for full inclusion, witnessing for democracy, for compassion, for Medicaid expansion, because that is the basis of our faith. Our faith is a compassionate faith. I speak for you. In your personal relationships, push back as you see fit, but it takes a long time for people to disengage from this. But you can still speak your witness. You can still speak your witness. You can still speak for the values that you hold and for what you believe in. It's up to Christians of good conscience to push back on this. All right, that's the end of my rant.
So we have some time now for questions. I'm going to start our sign-in sheet around. There is a table in the middle of the aisle here. And we do need to ask you to go to that microphone to ask a question, primarily so that the people who are joining us by live stream will also hear your question. You won't be on camera in that standing over there with the microphone, but you will be able to be heard. So come on, please go ahead and come on up if you have a question.
So we have a sign-up sheet going around, and I will also, this church, so I'll also send around an offering. If you want to support the work of Kansas Interfaith Action, please feel free. And now we'll take questions.
I've already asked Rabbi, how does the Christian identity movement, which is also strong in this area because they believe this is where Armageddon is going to happen, how do they fit in with white nationalism?
Christian identity movement.
I'm only vaguely familiar, but my sense is since 2016, stylish Christian nationalists have disassociated themselves from the fringe groups, from the the bunker dwelling folks, the ones who are more obviously radical. And so, I mean, even since January 6th, with so many of the Proud Boys now being behind bars, what we see is the face of Christian nationalism is Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House. It's what now count as mainstream conservatives who are willing to go along with the push from the far right that now exists in American politics. So I guess I don't worry too much about fringe groups. I mean, maybe this is cynical, but the worst they can usually do is small-scale acts of violence. The real threat comes from the people with the pens, not the people with the bunkers.
I have an observation. I noticed the Heritage Foundation was brought up, and I just want to report, I drive to Amarillo every Wednesday, and in Holyrood, Kansas, between Ellsworth and Claflin, there's a billboard, small billboard, top line says, America's Outpost in Washington. The line below that, the Heritage Foundation. Mm-hmm. And below that, fight right ideas. And I can't remember what the other one was, but it's there in rural Kansas. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's kind of links to a question that I had been thinking about for Dr. Jones, which is, what is the, as we think about the Christian nationalism, Christian identity, and you had a good point about it's not, don't look at really what people are doing, but look at the results. And I'm curious about, are we coming to a point, or what do you see in these trends where actually the Christian part, it'll just be white nationalism. The Christian part won't, because it does seem like there's some movement in these, what we're seeing, especially at the national level, where people don't even really seem to care to bother with the Christian element of it anymore. And I'm just curious to, would you agree with that, or how would you respond to that?
It's hard to imagine them disassociating from Christianity. I mean, there's so much rhetorical power in claiming Christian as well as white. And I mean, one of the big wins of the civil rights era was to really definitively make racist a bad thing. Like, it is still, even today in 2024, by and large, a ticket to marginalization, to claim white supremacy, or to claim, race realism, or some of these ideas. We still look very unfondly upon people who would openly identify as racist. Like, for instance, Richard Spencer, the guy who had a brief spike of popularity after the 2016 election, and then slid it back into his little hole. I think what I would expect is again, I mean, so much of this is grounded in a reaction to development since the 1960s, the growing secularity of the public sphere has led some Christians to embrace secularity in the public sphere and to more privatize their Christianity. I think I'm preaching to that choir here more. But others to feel that they have to more vigorously assert their Christianity in the public sphere. And something that Modi said that I think is really important is that white Christian nationalism is just as much Christian and white and nationalist in equal parts. It's a team identity. It's a club identity. It's a sense of who I am. And so if you're looking for like your demographic ideal of the white Christian nationalist, you're not looking for somebody with a swastika and a skin job and, you know, ladder lace Doc Martens or whatever. What you're looking for is the person who, when they picture President of the United States, wants to see a white man. You're looking for the person who thinks that it's better for a household to have one income, the man's income, who would disagree with your assertions about the Women's Bill of Rights by saying that women should depend on their men for these things. And that trans athletes are a threat because they undermine the hierarchical authority of the white Christian male over his household, and so on down the line. That's the face of white Christian nationalism. And I don't see white and Christian decoupling because there's no gain there. You know, what's the demographic of people who are like, you know, I would be a white Christian nationalist, but that Christian part really turns me off. You know, like that's not practical. And this is the cynic in me coming out, and that I see people's decisions as driven mostly by what they see as their practical goals. That's why people can contradict themselves and do things that make no sense. Like, for instance, being a sincere Bible-believing Christian who also sees Donald Trump as the Messiah. Those things make perfect sense in a lot of people's minds, even if they seem bizarre from the outside, because you make whatever you need to be true make sense to you to get through the day.
Thank you.
Yeah, but just like there's African Americans who support white supremacy, there's always going to be non-Christians who support Christian supremacy or there's going to be non-white Christians who support the Trump approach because of power, because it says what they believe about some aspect of something. I mean, it's in a multicultural, multiracial society, a certain percentage of minoritized people will always be sort of bought into power. I mean, you know, not to open up another can of worms, but, you know, the way that Jews relate to Israel also has an impact on this because they might decide that Trump is worth it because of what he provides in that regard, as opposed to kind of like Jews being mostly liberal historically. But I mean, it's very complicated.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, just to piggyback on that a little bit, is that, you know, by bringing minoritized people into white Christian nationalist spaces is plausible deniability. You can't call us racist. Look, my you know, director of public relations. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and so I think you're right that people who they see their access to power, and access to power is a huge motivator.
Gary.
Yeah, I guess I want to go to the issue of semantics of the terminology that we use. Who decided that we were white people? I lived for years among people for whom I was a coney, which their word for red. I was a red person. You know, it makes me think that when people address us, you know, they use a term, but did not the idea of us being white people arise from ourselves? That we decided to call ourselves white with all of the associations that go with this. You know, the absence of impurities, that being normative, and of course, people of color, you know, something of color contains, you know, pollutants and things like that. I just, you know, I guess invite some thoughts on that, you know, and of course that fits very well with Christianity, where, you know, that's the pure, that's the ideal, the normative, and others are something less than that. So, but really, you know, that term white and people of color, you know, there's something to that. There's something very powerful in how we designate different peoples.
Well, white mostly means not black. I mean, it was definitely a category that was brought up in opposition to something else. And it's very culturally conditioned, and it's very variable, because if you look at the history of immigration, Jews or Italians were not considered white necessarily in the way that we think of it now. You know, certainly WASPs, whatever, in the 20s, that when they were doing anti-immigration laws, it was those people they were trying to keep out. But then whiteness sort of needed to expand to keep its demographic majority, and it included people who were willing to, is again going back to this power question, like proximity to power, or the wage, or what W.E.B. Du Bois called the wages of whiteness. So you get this benefit of being white, so therefore you're white. You know, and when the, you know, in the particular case of Jews, which I know something about, you know, when the quotas in the colleges go down, Jews are included in whiteness in a way they never were before. At least white Jews, European descent Jews.
Yeah, and it also, I guess, you know, it spins out for me in that, you know, anyone, for instance, from a interracial marriage who is, you know, they're considered black people. You know, they're not white, even if they're predominantly white, but have a
Barack Obama
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
is the first
Right.
black president. He's exactly mixed race.
Yeah.
I mean, I teach an entire class called Race and Religion. How long do y'all have? We can talk about
We
this
have
for a
13
while.
weeks.
All right,
Chris.
so let me give you just like the 30-second rundown of all this stuff. So how many people here have heard of the doctrine of discovery? Okay, a few people. All right, this will be new to a lot of you. So basically, when Europeans started to venture out to trade with non-European peoples via the ocean, the church dictated that, this is the doctrine of discovery, if Christians encountering non-Christian people, they have the right to take their land and evangelize them, okay? So you have now a justification for Europeans landing in North America, Europeans landing in South America, Europeans landing in sub-Saharan Africa to claim the land for themselves, enslave, subjugate the people, and then Christianize them. So what happens? It works, and you end up with Native Americans and sub-Saharan enslaved Africans becoming Christian because wages of whiteness. They realize, hey, if I'm a Christian, I have rights again. But here's the thing: that doesn't play well with capitalism, emergent capitalism, with money, with all that. And so you see white Europeans in the 17th century move the goalpost. Well, the problem isn't that you're not Christian. The problem is race. And the thing is, religion can change. All you do is say, well, yeah, I'm a Christian now. But you can't change your race, at least not within the mindset of early modern race science. Race is considered immutable. And so strategically, it works well to invent the category of whiteness to describe people who have an unearned and inherent and eternal privilege over the others. Think about, into the 1800s, the 1900s, take up the white man's burden, bring the blessings of civilization to the benighted places of the world, et cetera, yada, yada, yada. The U.S. war in the Philippines was very much about bringing the blessings of civilization to the poor Filipino people who obviously had none of this. They were Christian by that time. The Spanish had already subjugated them. They were Catholics, and yet still they were ripe for colonization because they were not white. And you see that outside of, again, unreconstituted racists, the idea that, well, someday, the non-white people will be ready to govern themselves. But until that time, they need us to help them figure it out. And you can see that play out in foreign policy to, yesterday, right? I mean, that still very much is part of how we think of ourselves. And so maybe I'm going to preach for a second. I said I wasn't a preacher, but I'm going to preach. I think that it's too easy to look at fringe groups and January 6th rioters and say, oh, look at those ghouls out there. That's just insane. The thing is, anybody who grew up benefiting from whiteness in the United States has internalized some of these same ideas, some of these same attitudes. And I mean, if we
Or benefited from Christianity.
or both, exactly. And so I think it's up to us, and I'm calling myself in here, to do that work of sorting through that and recognizing those places where it exists in us. Because if we don't lead, who is going to, right? I think that is very, very important in combating white Christian nationalism, not just combating the white Christian nationalism, but seeing it in ourselves and recognizing what comes out in ourselves in places we don't expect, and doing that hard work of wrestling internally with the heritage of America's history to make a more perfect union, to use the title of Barack Obama's famous speech about his pastor.
Well, I'm going to add one quick thing to that Christian churches, Christian faith, traditionally, we look at our neighborhoods and say, oh, we see you have this problem, we can help fix it. We can write you a check. And that is very common. And we've got to move away from that too. I mean, how patronizing is that? We aren't here to fix your problem. We're here to love you and to be with you. And then maybe we can help if you need it. But we can't write it and tell you what your problem is. And then that will write you a check and make it better.
Well, we're here to listen.
Isn't this Christian nationalism a weird paranoid paragraph for white people? We're gradually being the minority. So why are they doing this in the first place? Because sooner or later, we're not going to be the majority. We're going to be the minority. Does it make any sense?
Well, actually, that's probably one of the reasons. Because when the majority status is in threat, then you would take measures to buttress it, to make it stronger, to make sure that you win the election, make sure that the electoral college goes your way, like doing things to game the system. And it would take given the way the American system is set up with the electoral college and sort of the rural advantage of the Senate, the Senate is also anti-democratic. It's actually not that hard to game the system in that way. Look at Georgia being the example. Knock out 250,000 people off the rolls, you win an election. Florida's the same thing.
It's not hard for them for Democrats to mobilize the black vote, like having the last election, and basically defeat, Republicans. It happens over and over again.
Well, it does happen, but it takes a lot of work. It takes a Herculean effort to do that. If it was just a straight vote, then it wouldn't take that much effort, but it does take a lot of effort to do that.
But it's gradually showing that white people are not the majority anymore.
That's
The one and only place where I unequivocally agree with white supremacists is the slogan, demographics is destiny. You can't fight math. You're absolutely right. Whiteness is I think 2041 is the year at which demographics indicate that white will become a minority, or at least a non-majority status in the United States. So think about this though, prior to the Great Migration in the early 20th century, most Southern states had more black than white people in them. And yet, black people had no electoral power because they had been systematically deprived of it. The Supreme Court gutted the Civil Rights Act, and we've seen since then gerrymandering and other legal attempts to disenfranchise and blunt the power of the black vote. That's what white Christian nationalism, it's not going to look like, armies of Nazis goose-stepping through Washington. It's going to look like states with black majorities or substantial minorities of people of color not being able to get their people elected because all of their votes are in one district, or because their polling places close at 2 p.m. or whatever other legal shenanigans make it the system game.
Well, the other aspect would be the expansion of whiteness, which we mentioned before. If a large population or a certain population of the Latino population starts to identify as white, or starts to feel proximate to power, or the Asian population, it doesn't take much for the demographics to shift and for whiteness to kind of redefine itself again to take advantage of demographic changes, which is something that's happened repeatedly over history.
Once upon a time, the Irish weren't white.
Jim.
Go a little bit of different direction. I learned recently from our ecumenical campus ministry at K-State that I believe she said there are 6 or 7 Christian organizations on campus at K-State. And the one that we claim, which our denomination gives very little money to, and it's pulled back, and I think other denominations have as well. But the one that she represents is the only one that promotes LGBTQ, the only one that promotes a progressive theology and an openness to students of all persuasions.
It's probably the only one that would accept women in religious leadership.
In fact, Christian Watkins is the only recognized female clergy person on the entire campus who has that sort of
Yes,
official. She's
Right.
the female clergy person who is acknowledged as a person allowed on campus in that capacity. And they've been identified by the group Turning Point USA as a campus that is like the prime campus in Kansas for more recruitment, which is a white Christian nationalist organization. Yeah.
I am wondering if the panel would agree with me, or Mother Doreen, any of us that represent faith communities would agree with me that let me back up and say, I had 6 cousins that grew up at about the same time and all went away to university at the same time. I'm the only one that came out with it in a progressive faith community. We were all raised in about the same place. They went away and came back and are now occupying leadership positions in faith communities that are very closed. And I don't know, I just feel like that university, and I'm wondering what it's like on the Washburn campus. What kind of students groups there are that represent inclusion and openness to all that we have mentioned here tonight. And what can we do about that? I, for one, believe that denominations need to back our ecumenical campus ministry in a much better way than what we're doing.
I think that's for you.
All right, so Washburn, I know a little bit about this, and I'm friends with most of the campus folks, so even the folks I'm going to be criticizing here are people that I work with and interact with a lot. So we have, to my knowledge, several Christian organizations. There is a Catholic organization. There are at least 3 evangelical Christian organizations. There's 1 Methodist student organization. And to my knowledge, the Methodist is the only one that moves in the direction of LGBTQ inclusion, but even they've hedged on it to some degree. And the others, so like Young Life is a good example of an org that has had female leadership. It has a large, diverse people of color, people of all backgrounds join. And they front themselves very much as everybody come in, everybody's welcome here. But students who try to get into leadership positions, if they are openly gay or LGBTQ, they are not able to. And I know that Young Life at Washburn has had some leadership churn because some leaders refuse to follow the national brand and be essentially closed to LGBTQ leadership. I know that one of the campus orgs, Call to Greatness, did a field trip to listen to a virulently anti-trans speaker in Lawrence give a talk on how trans identity is fake, how people who transition want to go back, and yada, 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 a lot of junk science. So, I mean, here's what I'll say about the whole Washburn. Trying to think how I want to phrase all of this, right? What I've learned about young people in Kansas is that Christian is a very important identity for them, and it's almost completely an empty signifier. It has no substance whatsoever except that God likes me and wants me to be happy, and as long as I'm not a jerk to people, I'm doing all the right things. So they have Philippians 4:13 in their Instagram profile. I can do all things through God who gives me strength. And just have no idea what any of that is. So the first person with a smile who comes along and says, this is what Christian means, gets a lot of credibility, right? And so I think that's why you see so much energy from evangelicals. And I'll say that, with some of my evangelical friends who are in campus orgs do a lot of good work with students, but I don't agree with them politically or more importantly on issues of justice. And so, for instance, I refuse to be on a panel with some folks from these orgs because I'm advisor to a number of gay students, and I don't want to be in public in a position of authority with somebody who does not think that they have full inclusion, right? So, I mean, if the thrust of the question is ultimately should, progressive Christians have more space on college campuses? Yes, there's definitely a desire for it. And so I think a lot of that is just mobilizing that and finding enough focus to get something like that rolling.
All right, I think we've come to the conclusion of our event. It looks like. You think?
I think April was going to make her way over to the microphone. Can we give her
Yeah, of course.
point of privilege here to address our crowd? I think one of the things we haven't really touched on as much in specifics are, the real immediate and direct ways that people of faith can take action. Like every single person sitting in this room has the capacity to walk into the State House and talk to your legislators or show up for a day. And we've talked at kind of a very high level of some big ways that, some big, huge, overwhelming issues where that is important. But I think sometimes it comes out in surprisingly non-controversial places, or what one would think would be that, we often say that actually we're not a far left group, right? Kansas Interfaith Action does not represent the far left. We represent, but according to polling, the majority of Kansans, usually 70 to 80% of Kansans on these issues. So I'm kind of trying to set up the mic a little bit for what I think April might be.
No, I'm not going to talk about Medicaid expansion. So
you're off, right?
Yeah.
You're off the clock.
I actually wanted to ask, I think that, we have teenage sons who are active on social media, and I think that they are encountering white nationalists, almost predatory, social media personalities and what have you, that they're becoming confused. I mean, I think it's okay because we know about it and we've talked about it, but do you have thoughts about that? How the kind of the sneakiness of that movement is in trying to recruit young people and really people of all ages?
Yeah,
and how you can protect yourself from that.
For sure. I'll just briefly jump in and say, yes, absolutely. That's definitely happening. That's a real thing. It's happening at a very high level. And a few of the groups that I think it's helpful, a lot of folks who talk about the history of white Christian nationalism will spend some time talking about the history of newsletter publications, Moody Bible Institute as one of the kind of early users of mass media, then the rise of radio networks and the religious rights use of, so every time there's a new medium for propaganda, the religious right has learned quickly and very efficiently and put a ton of resources into using that medium very effectively. So it shouldn't surprise us that that's also true when it comes to social media. And the groups that are out there are prolific. They are using social media extremely well. They have a strategy, they have a budget, they have insiders, in the form of young people who use that as kind of native users. And I'm trying to remember the name of, I'm looking up in my another set of slides very slowly here on my slow internet connection. Some of the groups that are specifically engaged with this, not that it matters, because it's not like they brand, Turning Point USA is one of them, but it's not like they put their little logo on all of their social media content. Kids aren't going to be like, ooh, watch out for that logo. The Council for National, not Council for National Policy. I know there's another big group out there and I can't think of it. I don't know if you can remember, Moti. There's another group that's doing a lot of this social media messaging. They have influencers that are extremely active. The book Shadow Network, Shadow Network talks a little bit about that. It's media, what the religious right are involved in the media. So yeah, I think all we can do is, teach kids. There's actually, Finland has been in the news a little bit about the required curriculum that they have to teach kids. It's part of the, primary and secondary curriculum about propaganda. What is propaganda? How do you recognize propaganda? How do you understand? How do you root it out? It's just an important required part of their education. I don't think that necessarily comes into play for our high school kids.
Can I speak to this a little bit? We have
Yeah.
time? All right. So I work with Gen Z a lot, and I'm going to be honest. I'm not that worried about the kids. I'm worried about them in a lot of other ways, but with social media, what I've noticed about Gen Z is that they can, forgive my language here, they can spot bullshit a mile off. They can spot an agenda a mile off. They are so used to having people advertise to them that they pick up on agendas like that. And at the very least, they'll ask people they trust. Like they'll ask me, like, "Hey, is this legit?" And be like, "No," and that's fine. I worry about people my age who are not digital natives, who do not grow up with it, who are not inoculated against online lies and get sucked into it. And so, if you look at research on online radicalization, ideology has almost nothing to do with it. People are not pulled into radical groups because they are ideologically convinced. The online recruiters target anybody they can find who is lonely and angry. And what they do is they give substance to that anger. Your life sucks because of minorities, atheists, trans people, whoever the scapegoat of the day is. And you can get back at them by doing this, this, and this. And you can be on a team with other people who know the truth, who have taken the red pill and understand the reality of things, that it's the Jews or it's the liberals or it's whatever scapegoat. Jews are always a popular one with the radicals for a lot of reasons. But anyway, just to come back around, right? Like the most important thing you can do if you're worried about people getting radicalized, don't let them become isolated. Make sure that you are like in contact with kids and grandkids and that you're talking to them. Make sure that the uncle in the family who believes online conspiracy theories and says weird things at Thanksgiving, don't argue with them. Just ask questions about non-controversial stuff. Make them feel loved and included. That's going to do a whole lot more than having all your talking points about why white Christian nationalism is bad. Because that's just going to isolate further. It's going to confirm what the online recruiters are saying, right? Nobody gets it. They don't understand. They're already part of, they're the sheeple. They're the sheeple, and you know the truth, my friend. And you're one of them. No, just love people. Love people. That's the best way to keep them from getting radicalized.
Yeah, I guess another thing I would add to that is, one of the things that we talk about with Kifa and why we work with communities of faith is, I really believe that in the absence of good religion, that spirituality is an innate human need. And if it's not satisfied with good religion, then it will be satisfied with bad religion. And I think that goes back to the question about K-State and whether progressive Christians are working the fields, and I think that's one of the things about liberals in general is they tend not to have the courage of their convictions. A lot of times, there's a lot of kind of moral ambiguity or moral kind of not really saying what we believe in because we think that multicultural or multiplicity means everybody's beliefs are valid. And I think that's a real problem because it keeps us from being full voiced. I look with some bemusement at the fact that looking at Christian history or church history in the 20th century, did you know that there used to be this thing called the social gospel? Jim probably has heard of that, right? Like this was the thing. It was like a huge thing. It was like when you thought about mainstream Christianity in the mid 20th century, you thought about the social gospel. That was the branding, to kind of use an arch marketing term. Where did that go? It doesn't. Nobody talks about that anymore. It was like the greatest. It was like the greatest thing that form of Christianity had going for it, and they just gave it up. Because people started pushing back or whatever. And, I really believe that I would rather, and this is now sort of going off topic a little bit, but I would much rather have smaller congregations that are missional and know what they believe in and stand for what they believe in than bigger congregations that are afraid of saying anything. I think that the big congregations, or not even big congregations, you're not solving that problem by not being offensive. So instead you have a Lutheran church that's 75-year-olds, with all forgiveness, with all excuse, please, for 75-year-olds in the room, but you have 75-year-olds, and you're afraid of saying anything because the church will go away. The church already went away. The only way you're going to be who you need to be in the world is by being who you need to be in the world, and that requires a courage that I think most mainstream Christians haven't really shown. Hopefully you'll forgive me for speaking this way to you. But I think what we're seeing is the repercussions of that, which is kids who need things to believe in, who don't care about nice as much or whatever. They don't care about fellowship hour as much. They want their religion to mean something. And if you don't give it to them, they're going to find it somewhere else.
Yeah, they already are, in
Well,
fact.
I'll add, all you ever hear from mainstream Christian faiths is bemoaning the fact that the numbers of people attending church is going down, going down, is going down. I'm like, the people in the pews now are people who are committed to their faith. They're not here because they want to get into Topeka Country Club or become a banker somewhere like they did in the 50s. They are here because they love God and they love their neighbor. And so the time is ripe in Christian churches to activate. Let's go, let's do this. Because that's the people who are here, you.
Yep. Tim. Yes, thank you. Thank you especially to our panelists for being here tonight. And thank you all for coming out on a Tuesday night and spending this time with us. And we hope you'll sign up for emails if you want to be kept in the loop on the specifics. We try to only do one a week. We try to not overwhelm you unless there's a really specific action alert during the session. So please reach out to us and invite us to your local congregations too. If you're from other places here in town, we'd love to visit. Thank you so much. Hey, thanks for coming.